What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. I know it's been a while, but I've just been taking a little break. So today's story is called The Frozen Dead. The thermometer outside the gas station read negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before the wind chill. I pulled my scarf tighter across my face, leaving only my eyes exposed as I pumped what might be the last tank of gas this side of the Canadian border. My breath crystallized in the air, tiny ice crystals that caught the pale morning light like broken glass. 3 weeks ago, I'd been teaching American literature at SUNY Potsdam, worried about tenure reviews and whether my students actually read the assigned chapters. Now, I was standing in an abandoned Stewart shop in Messina, listening to the wind howl across the frozen St. Lawrence River, trying to decide if the road north to Cornwall was worth the risk. My name is Marcus Webb, and I stayed too long. Everyone knew something was wrong when the hospital in Watertown went dark on Halloween. No one knew it was the beginning of the end. The initial reports were typical media confusion. A drug outbreak, bath salts making people violent, then PCP, then terrorism. By the time the CDC showed up in their moon suits, it had already spread through Jefferson County like wildfire. Except wildfire is the wrong metaphor when the world's ending in a winter that came early and stayed late. This was more like frostbite, creeping, numbing, turning everything dead from the extremities inward. I clicked the pump handle back into place at $42. What would have been the highway robbery back when my money meant something, and climbed into my Ford Explorer. The engine rumbled reassuringly, and I let it idle for a moment, studying the road map spread across my passenger seat. My destination was circled in red Sharpie. Malone, about 30 miles northeast. My brother David lived there with his wife and 2 kids. Lived. Past tense, probably. I hadn't heard from him in 12 days. But I had to know. The radio crackled with static as I twisted the dial, searching for any signal. Most stations had gone silent in a few weeks. A few emergency broadcasts had lasted into week 2, but those had dissolved into chaos. Conflicting evacuation orders, rumors of safe zones that turned out to be slaughterhouses, desperate people screaming for help that wasn't coming. Now there was just the static, and occasionally, something worse. Screaming that didn't sound quite human. I left the radio off and pulled on to Route 37. The highway stretched before me like a frozen grave, buried under 3 feet of snow that the plows would never clear again. I kept to the tracks left by previous vehicles, most days old, judging by the drifts. The Explorer's all-wheel drive bit into the packed snow with a steady crunch that was almost meditative. On both sides of the road, pine trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with ice. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I saw the first body. It was off to the right, partially buried in a snowbank where the road curved. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We had plenty of those, usually causing accidents or eating through everyone's gardens. But as I got closer, I could make out the distinct shape of a human torso. One arm thrust upward through the snow like I was waving for help that had come too late. I kept driving. There was nothing I could do for them. The dead didn't bother me anymore. Not the ones that stayed dead, anyway. I'd seen enough of those in the first days to build up a callus over that particular wound. It was the other ones that troubled my sleep. The ones that got back up despite the cold that should have frozen them solid. They shouldn't have been able to move at all. Not in this weather. That's what the government scientists had said in their final briefings before everything collapsed. The infection, virus, fungus, parasite, whatever the hell it was, should have been neutralized by temperatures below freezing. The host should have become popsicles, easy to avoid or destroy. but the dead don't read scientific papers. Whatever reanimated them seemed to generate its own heat, at least enough to keep the core functioning. I'd seen it myself, steam rising from their mouths in the frigid air, frost forming on their clothes and faces, but never quite freezing them completely. They were slower in the cold. That much was true. But slow didn't mean stopped. And it definitely didn't mean safe. I rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. 3 cars blocked the road ahead, arranged in a rough barricade. They'd been there for a while. Snow had drifted up to their wheel wells, and ice coated the windows in thick sheets. One was a minivan with a shattered windshield. Another was an overturned pickup truck. The third was a state police cruiser, its driver door hanging open. This was a checkpoint. Or it had been. I put the Explorer in park and sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to decide. I could probably drive around it through the ditch, but the snow depth was uncertain, and the last thing I needed was to get stuck. The alternative was to get out and move something, which meant exposing myself. The wind howled, rattling my vehicle. Snow devils spun across the road like ghostly dancers. I made my decision. Killed the engine, and reached for the rifle in my back seat. The Remington 700 had been my father's deer rifle. I'd inherited it along with his gun cabinet when he died of a heart attack 5 years ago, and I'd barely touched it myself. A few trips at the range to satisfy my brother's insistence that I should keep my skills up. David had been in the military, 2 tours in Iraq, and he never quite understood my preference for books over firearms. I'd never quite understood his need to keep preparing for something terrible. Turned out, he'd been right. I also grabbed my pistol, a Glock 19 that David had given me last Christmas with a lecture about home defense, and made sure I had extra magazines in my coat pockets. Then I pulled on my insulated gloves, wrapped my scarf tighter, and stepped out into the wind. The cold hit me like a physical blow. -18 before wind chill meant it was probably pushing -30 or worse with the gusts coming off the river. Exposed skin would get frostbite in minutes. I moved quickly toward the police cruiser, rifle up, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved except the wind and snow. The cruiser's interior was a disaster. The driver's seat was soaked in dried blood. So much of it that it had pooled on the floor and frozen in a dark red ice slick. The dashboard computer was shattered. Bullet holes stippled the passenger side door from the inside out. Someone had made their last stand here. I'd hoped they'd taken out some of the bastards with them. I checked the trunk. Police cruisers often carried rifles and extra ammunition. It was open, but empty, except for road flares and a first aid kit. Either the cop had taken everything with them, or someone else had already looted it. I grabbed the flares anyway. Fire was life in this weather. A sound made me freeze. It came from behind the overturned pickup truck. A low, wet scraping sound, like someone dragging meat across ice. I raised my rifle and waited. "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the cold, muffled and distant. The scraping stopped. I waited 10 heartbeats, then 20. My fingers were already starting to ache in the cold despite the gloves. I couldn't stand out here much longer. "If you're alive, I'm not here to hurt you," I called out. "If you need help." The thing that came around the pickup truck wasn't alive, and it definitely didn't need help. It had been a man once, maybe 40 years old, wearing a torn and bloody Parks Department uniform. One of his arms was gone, ripped off at the shoulder, and his face was a ruin of frozen gore. But his eyes, God, his eyes were the worst part. They fixed on me with an intensity that was almost intelligent, almost aware. And then his mouth opened in a soundless howl that showed broken teeth and a blackened tongue. I shot him in the head from 20 feet away. The rifle's report echoed across the frozen landscape like thunder. The dead man, the thing, crumpled into the snow, finally still. Dark fluid leaked from the wound in its skull, steaming in the cold air. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from the cold and adrenaline. I'd killed 7 of them in the past 3 weeks. It didn't get easier, but it didn't get harder either. You just did it and moved on, or you became one of them. I checked the other vehicles quickly, rifle at the ready, but found no other threats. The minivan was empty except for abandoned luggage and a child's car seat that I tried not to look at too closely. I returned to the Explorer, started the engine, and carefully maneuvered around the barricade through the ditch. The tires spun once, twice, then caught, and I was back on the road. My hands had gone numb. I cranked the heat and held them in front of the vents, waiting for the painful prickling that meant feeling was returning. Outside, the body of the Parks Department worker lay in the snow. Just another frozen corpse on a highway full of them. 3 miles later, I saw smoke. It was rising from somewhere ahead and to the right, a dark smudge against the white sky. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant survivors. Maybe. Or it meant a trap. I slowed down, studying the terrain. The smoke was coming from what looked like a farmhouse set back from the road, maybe a quarter mile up a private drive. The drive had been plowed recently, within the past day or two, judging by the snow accumulation. Vehicle tracks led up to the house. Someone was definitely there. I pulled over and cut the engine again, considering my options. I had enough supplies to reach him alone without stopping. Food, water, fuel. The smart move was to keep driving. Every stop was a risk. Every interaction with other survivors a potential disaster. I'd learned that the hard way in Potsdam, when a group of my fellow faculty members had decided that my stockpile of food meant they had a right to it, and my protests meant I was selfish. I still had the scar on my shoulder from where Professor Richardson stabbed me with a kitchen knife. But smoke also meant warmth. It meant I could stop for an hour, let the cold leach out of my bones, maybe even boil some water for coffee. And if they had news, any information about the road ahead. The wind gusted, rocking the Explorer on its suspension. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -22. It was dropping as the sun climbed higher. A paradox of deep winter in northern New York. Sometimes the clearest days were the coldest. I made my decision and started the engine, turning carefully onto the private drive. The farmhouse was old, probably built in the 1950s. A white 2-story with green shutters and a wraparound porch. Smoke poured from the chimney, and I could see lights in the windows, either candles or a generator. A barn stood behind the house, its red paint faded and peeling. 2 vehicles were parked in the clearing ahead and front, a Ford F-250 and a Subaru Outback, both dusted with recent snow. I stopped about 50 feet from the house, in clear view of the windows, and waited. Within 30 seconds, the front door opened. A woman stepped out on the porch, holding a shotgun. She was bundled in a heavy coat and wore a bright red knit cap that seemed almost obscenely cheerful against the gray landscape. Even from this distance, I could see she was my age, maybe late 30s, with dark skin and an expression that said she'd shot her fair share of dead things. I rolled down my window an inch and called out, "I'm not infected! Just passing through and saw your smoke." She didn't lower the shotgun. "Where are you headed?" "Malone. Looking for family." "You alone?" "Yeah." She studied me for a long moment, then turned her head and said something to someone inside the house. A man emerged, tall, older, with a gray beard and a hunting rifle. He looked me over with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent time in the military. The woman called out again. "You can come up, but keep your hands where I can see them. Any sudden moves and Tom here will put a bullet through your windshield. He doesn't miss." I believed her. I shut off the engine and stepped out slowly, hands raised to shoulder height. My rifle stayed in the vehicle. The Glock was under my coat, but I wasn't about to reach for it. As I crunched through the snow toward the porch, I got a better look at them. The woman was younger than I'd first thought, maybe 35, with tired eyes and a confident grip on her weapon. The man, Tom, was in his 60s, silver-haired and weathered, with a kind of stillness that came from being comfortable with violence. "I'm Marcus," I said when I reached the porch step. "Marcus Webb. I taught at SUNY Potsdam before everything went to hell." "Professor?" The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "English?" "American Lit. You?" "Nurse. Canton Potsdam Hospital. Before..." She gestured vaguely at the world. "Vanessa Pierce. This is Tom Whitaker. He owned this place." Tom nodded but didn't lower his rifle. "You said you're going to Boulogne?" "My brother lives there. David Webb. Or lived there. I haven't heard from him since this started." Something flickered across Tom's face. Not quite pity, but close. "Malone got hit hard, son. Real hard. We've had some folks come through that direction. The stories weren't good." My chest tightened. "When?" "About a week ago. Group of 4, heading south. They said the town was overrun. That the emergency shelter at the high school had collapsed. People tried to flee into Canada, but the border is completely locked down. Not even military can get through. They shoot on sight." I'd known it was bad. I'd known my brother was probably dead. But knowing and hearing confirmation were different things. I felt something hollow open up in my chest. Vanessa saw my expression, and her voice softened. "Come inside. You look frozen. We've got coffee and a wood stove. You can warm up before you decide to do what's next." I should have kept driving. I should have thanked them and gotten back to my Explorer and pushed to Malone, to see for myself, to find David's house and know for certain. But the cold had seeped into my bones, and the thought of hot coffee was almost painfully appealing. And besides, I was so damn tired of being alone. "Thank you," I said. Tom finally lowered his rifle and stepped aside to let me enter. The interior of the farmhouse was warm, almost shockingly so after the brutal cold outside. A massive cast-iron wood stove dominated the living room, radiating heat. Candles burned on every surface, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. I saw signs of other occupants, sleeping bags rolled up in the corners, a pile of boots and coats by the door, supplies stacked neatly on the bookshelves that had been cleared of books. "How many of you are here?" I asked, unwrapping my scarf. 6, Vanessa said, setting her shotgun by the door but keeping it within reach. "Tom, me, and 4 others. Sarah and her son Jake are upstairs sleeping. They were on watch last night. Mike's in the barn checking the generator." Tom moved to the wood stove and picked up a battered metal coffee pot. "We've got a decent setup here. Tom's property runs 100 acres, mostly wooded. Good sight lines, only one road in. We've got a well, the wood stove, and Mike got the generator working so we can run a few lights and charge batteries." "You planning on staying long term?" I asked, accepting a cup of coffee that was almost black enough to stand a spoon. Vanessa and Tom exchanged a glance. Tom answered, "For the winter, at least. Maybe longer, if we can get through to the spring. The cold it's keeping them slower, but it's also killing anyone who tries to move around too much. We lost 2 people in the first week, both to exposure. Went out for a supply run and got caught in a storm." I sipped the coffee. It was terrible and wonderful at the same time. "Any idea what's happening on a larger scale? Government response, military, anything?" Vanessa shook her head. "The last news we heard was nearly 2 weeks ago. Someone with a ham radio picked up a broadcast from Fort Drum. The base was still operational then. Said they were working on some kind of solution. But we haven't heard anything since. Either they went dark or..." She didn't need to finish. "Or they're all dead," I said. "Yeah." We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wood crackle in the stove and the wind howl outside. Then Vanessa asked, "So, what's your plan? If Malone is as bad as they've heard, are you still going?" I thought about David, about Jessica, his wife. with her infectious laugh and terrible cooking. About Emma and Liam, my niece and nephew, 8 and 5 years old, who called me Uncle Mark and thought I was the coolest person alive because I could quote every line from their favorite movies. I have to, I said. I have to know. Tom nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting that answer. Then take my advice. Don't go in through town. Loop around to the north. Come in through the residential area. The main roads will be clogged with abandoned cars and dead things. And for God's sake, don't go near the high school or the hospital. That's where they congregate. They congregate? That was new information. I thought they just wandered. Mostly they do, Vanessa said. But we've seen them gathering in certain places. Buildings with lots of bodies, usually. Places where people tried to shelter. It's like they were drawn to where the dying happened. Or maybe they're just stupid and get trapped in enclosed spaces. Either way, those places are death traps. The front door opened with a blast of cold air, and a man entered, stomping snow from his boots. He was my age, stocky and bearded, wearing a grease-stained Carhartt jacket. He looked at me with surprise, then suspicion. "Who's this?" "Marcus Webb," I said. "Just passing through." "Mike Dalton," he replied, though he didn't offer his hand. His eyes stayed weary. "Where from?" "Potsdam. Heading to Malone." "Jesus, why?" "Family." That single word seemed to soften something in his expression. He nodded and moved toward the wood stove, holding his hands out to warm them. "Generator's running fine. We've got another week of propane, maybe 2 if we're careful." We talked for the next hour. About supplies, about the infection, about the desperate calculus of survival in a world that had frozen over and died. I learned that Vanessa had been caught at the hospital when the outbreak started, and watched her coworkers turn one by one until she'd fled with nothing but her scrubs and a scalpel. Tom had been a Vietnam vet who'd spent the last 20 years of his life preparing for some vague apocalypse, never really believing it would come. Mike had been a mechanic in Messina, with a wife and daughter who hadn't made it out of their apartment building. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone had a story about the moment they realized the world was ending. I told them about Potsdam, about the university's attempt to quarantine the campus, about how it had fallen apart when the food ran low and people got desperate, about Professor Richardson and the kitchen knife, about the night I'd killed my first infected, a grad student named Amy Chen, who had shared coffee with 100 times in the faculty lounge, who'd taught me about classical Chinese poetry, who'd come at me with bloody hands and dead eyes. "The worst part is that they're so slow in this cold," Vanessa said quietly. "You can see them coming. You have time to think about who they used to be before you pull the trigger." "Yeah," I agreed. "That is the worst part." Outside, the light was starting to fade. The days were short this far north in December, barely 7 hours of sunlight, and that was on a clear day. I glanced at my watch. 3:30 p.m. I needed to make a decision. "I should get moving," I said, standing. "I want to reach Malone before dark." Tom stood as well. "Hold on a minute." He disappeared into another room and returned with a handheld radio. "VHF, Channel 7. We keep a watch on it. If you run into trouble, give us a call. We might not be able to help, but at least someone will know." I took the radio, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. For the coffee, for the information, everything." "Stay alive, Marcus," Vanessa said. "If you find your family, if they're still okay, come back this way. We could use more people." "And if they're not?" I asked. "Then come back anyway. Nobody should be alone out there." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and pulled my scarf back into place. The cold slapped me as soon as I stepped outside, shocking after the warmth of the house. I made my way to the Explorer, feeling Tom and Vanessa watching from the porch. The engine started on the first try, and I gave them a final wave before heading down to the drive. In my rearview mirror, I saw them standing together, dark figures against the lit windows of the farmhouse. Then I turned onto the highway, and they disappeared from view. The last 20 miles to Malone took me an hour. The road conditions deteriorated as I went north. The tracks I'd been following petering out until I was plowing through virgin snow, hoping I was still on the highway and not about to drive into a ditch. The sun set in a blaze of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I hadn't meant I was about to be driving into the dark, in sub-zero temperatures, toward a town that might be full of the infected. I saw them before I reached the town proper. They stood along the roadside like frozen statues, covered in snow and ice, so still that I almost mistook them for trees at first. But as my headlights swept across them, I could see the human shapes, the torn clothing, the dark stains in the snow at their feet. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all facing the same direction, toward the center of town. They didn't move as I drove past. The cold had slowed them to near immobility, but I could see steam rising from some of them, that impossible heat that kept them animated. Come nightfall, when the temperature dropped even further, they might stop moving entirely. Or they might not. The rules seemed to change day by day. I followed Tom's advice and looped north, avoiding the main street. The residential area was dark and dead, buried under snow. Cars sat frozen in driveways. Christmas lights still hung from a few porches, unlit, remnants of holiday that would have never come. Every house could have been full of bodies, or full of infected, or full of survivors hiding in the dark. There was no way to know. David's house is on Elm Street, a modest ranch with a 2-car garage and a swing set in the backyard. I'd visited last summer for Emma's birthday, had helped David grill hamburgers while Jessica organized a treasure hunt for the kids. It had been hot and loud and chaotic and perfect. Now it was dark and silent, half buried in snow. I parked in the driveway, leaving the engine running. The house showed no lights, no signs of life. The front door was closed. No broken windows. That was something, at least. It didn't look like it had been breached. I took the Glock in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and stepped out into the frigid night. The cold was unbearable now, probably pushing -40 with the wind chill. My exposed skin burned. I had maybe 5 minutes before the frostbite became a real danger. I hurried to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. I knocked hard. "Jessica! David! It's Marcus! Are you in there?" Nothing. I knocked again, shouting louder, but the house remained dark and silent. I moved around to the back, trying to peer through windows, but the interior is pitch black. I tried the back door, also locked. The garage door, same. They had a spare key. David had told me about it, made a joke about it. Where was it? Under a flower pot or a fake rock or... No, it was magnetic, attached to the underside of the porch railing. I found it on the third try. My fingers were so numb I could barely feel a small metal box. I got the front door open and stepped inside, flashlight sweeping the darkness. "David! It's Marcus! I'm coming in!" The house was cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold enough that I could see my breath. That meant the heat had been off for days, maybe weeks. My flashlight beam picked out familiar details. Family photos on the walls. Emma's backpack by the door. A row of winter coats on hooks. The living room was untouched. So was the kitchen. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. That was good, I told myself. That was good. I checked the bedrooms one by one. David and Jessica's room, empty. Bed neatly made. Emma's room, empty. Stuffed animals arranged on the pillow. Liam's room, empty. Toy dinosaurs frozen in some eternal battle on the floor. The basement. I stood at the top of the basement stairs for a full minute, trying to make myself descend. The flashlight beam showed wooden steps leading down into darkness. Nothing moved in that darkness. No sounds came from below. But I had to know. I went down slowly, Glock raised, flashlight attached to the barrel. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor and exposed beams. Storage boxes were stacked against the walls. An old couch sat in one corner. And there, in the far corner, a note pinned to a support beam with a kitchen knife. I crossed the basement and pulled it free with shaking hands. The handwriting was David's, hasty but legible. Mark, if you're reading this, you made it further than most. We tried to wait, but Emma got sick and the shelter at the high school was our only option. This was November 4th. I don't know if we'll make it. The radio says they're evacuating people north, but I don't believe it anymore. I should have listened to you about staying put. Should have planned better. I'm sorry. If we don't make it, tell Mom and Dad we tried. Tell them we love them. Your brother, David. I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. The high school. But Tom and Vanessa had warned me about the high school. David had taken his family there anyway, because his daughter was sick and he was desperate, and that's what parents do. I stood in that cold basement for a long time. Long enough that my fingers started to lose feeling again. Then I went back upstairs, locked the door behind me, and returned to the Explorer. The engine was still running. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. I had food, water, ammunition. I had a map and a radio. I had Tom's advice ringing in my ears. Don't go near the high school. I put the Explorer in gear and headed toward the center of town. The high school was a sprawling complex on the north side of Malone, built in the 70s and expanded twice since then. It had a capacity of about 800 students. God only knew how many people had tried to shelter there when everything collapsed. I saw the smoke before I saw the building. Not the clean wood smoke of a warming fire, but the thick black smoke of something chemical burning. And I saw them. Hundreds of infected, maybe thousands, surrounding the school in a loose perimeter. They stood motionless in the snow, frozen in place by the brutal cold, but their eyes tracked by headlights as I approached. The main entrance had been barricaded at some point, cars and furniture piled against the doors, but the barricade had been breached. The doors hung open, and from inside I could see the flicker of flames. Someone had set fire to the school. I stopped the Explorer about 100 yards away and sat there, engine idling, trying to think. The infected were slow in this cold. I might be able to get inside, search for David and his family, and get out. Might. Or I might get trapped in a burning building full of the dead, which seemed like a particularly horrible way to die. The smart thing to do was drive away. David's note had been dated November 4th. Today was November 28th. Nearly a month had passed. If they'd been in the school when it fell, they were gone. Finding their bodies wouldn't change that. Going in there would just add mine to the count. But they were my family. David was my brother. Emma and Liam were... A figure emerged from the school's main entrance. It was human shape but moving wrong, jerky and uncoordinated. The firelight behind it threw its shadow long across the snow. As I watched, it was followed by another figure, then another. They spilled out of the burning building like ants from a disturbed nest, drawn by my headlights or my engine or just the promise of something alive in this frozen dead world. I counted 12, 24, more still coming. I put the Explorer in reverse and backed away slowly. The infected followed, their pace agonizingly slow in the extreme cold but relentless. I could outrun them easily, but more were emerging from the school, and others were still stirring in the surrounding area, drawn by the movement. A hand slammed against my window, making me jump. One of them had gotten closer than I'd realized. A woman in a torn postal service uniform, her face a mask of frost and gore. She clawed at the window, her frozen fingers making a horrible scraping sound. I accelerated backwards, and she fell away, disappearing under the snow. I didn't stop to see if she got up. By the time I reached the town's edge, I had a convoy of at least 50 infected trailing behind, their forms dark against the burning school. I turned onto the highway and floored it, leaving them behind in the darkness. I drove south for an hour before I pulled over, hands shaking too badly to continue. The tears I'd been holding back finally came. freezing on my cheeks almost instantly. I wiped them away roughly and stared at the road ahead. David was gone. Jessica was gone. Emma and Liam were gone. My family was gone. I was alone. The radio Tom had given me cracked to life, making me jump. Marcus, this is Tom. You out there? Over. I grabbed the radio with numb fingers. I'm here. Over. You found what you were looking for? Over. I thought about lying, but what was the point? No. They're gone. Over. A long pause, then. I'm sorry, son. You coming back this way? Over. I looked at the road ahead, disappearing into the darkness and snow. I thought about that warm farmhouse, about Vanessa and Tom and Mike and the others, about Vanessa's words. Nobody should be alone out there. Yeah, I said into the radio. Yeah, I am. Be there in about 40 minutes. Over. We'll leave the light on. Tom out. I started the engine and turned the Explorer around. Behind me, Malone burned. Ahead of me, somewhere in the darkness, was a farmhouse full of strangers who might become something more. It wasn't much of a future, but it was the only one I had. The frozen dead would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. But tonight, I would sit by a warm fire and drink terrible coffee and not be alone. Tomorrow I would figure out how to survive this winter. And maybe, just maybe, I'd figure out how to live. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed part 1 of possibly a 4-part series. I'm not sure how long I'm going to push this thing out to. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. I love when the elements are like a key factor of zombie apocalypse, not just like a basic whatever thing. But I've lived in cold areas my entire life, and honestly, the idea of a zombie apocalypse happening in the wintertime sounds possibly like the worst thing ever. But again, I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for part 2 of The Frozen Dead. And as always, remember to face your fears.